this very serious deformation, a short little gnarly man. He loved to tell stories about he's riding on a train in Spain, in Italy, and some worker starts talking to him about politics, and the politics goes, and the worker gets all excited and says, our great leader, Antonio Gramsci. And so Gramsci looks at him and says, that's me. And the guy gets up and smacks him. How disrespectful it is for someone like you, because Gramsci had to be this great, you know, bigger than life person, not a little gnarly fellow who could hardly stand up. But here's the interesting thing about Gramsci that we identify with personally. His family did not think he would survive because the local people had a baby that looked like this wasn't going to live. So, in the tradition of that family, he was kept for the first year or so of his life, or 2 years of his life, or maybe even more, in a bed next to a table upon which his coffin sat, waiting for him to be put in the coffin which he was destined to be. You don't need an advanced degree in psychology to recognize this can leave some scars to be treated as the person about to die for such a long time and to be gazing each evening on your own coffin. Steve and I found this story extraordinarily interesting, and I know it's important because he used to tell it to me repeatedly, and I told it to him repeatedly, and each of us would remind the other one how often we had already heard this story from one another, and yet it kept being important. Well, you know, hint, something is going on. What Gramsci, however, theoretically meant to us was this. Gramsci's argument was that he loved and admired Lenin so much because of the Russian Revolution and the creation of the Russian institution called the Soviet. The translation into Italian of the Soviet is worker council, which has become important to all kinds of political movement, a council of work. And Gramsci was persuaded that this was the way to go, and this was the way he did go in the town, the city, I forget right now, northern Torino, where he did his organizing with the Fiat automobile workers and so on. But it didn't work for Gramsci, as we know. There was a general strike, it was very powerful, but it failed in the end. And Gramsci then, like so many Marxists, had to answer the question, why do we fail? And his answer went something like this. A revolution needs not only the objective conditions, the conditions of economics and politics that make it possible, but it also has to have the subjective conditions. That is, people's mentality, their attitudes, their feelings, their impulses, their beliefs have to be such that they can see the opportunity and take advantage of it. If you have an objective condition of revolutionary possibility, which he thought he had in Torino in that period of time, in the late teens, early 1920, the conclusion Gramsci reached, we didn't have the intellectual, the cultural, the mental, the subjective conditions. And a revolutionary has to be focused on both. We have to be open to tracing through how an economic crisis can at the same time stymie the consciousness of the workers to take advantage of the revolutionary moment, and thereby the revolution is missed, the opportunity is missed. And the next step he took, and he took it explicitly in his writings in the prison notebooks, was to say, we have to understand how, here we go, the economics shape the consciousness, and the consciousness shapes the economic. There's no place for economic determinism. You don't get a one-way line that goes from economics to politics and culture, as in classical Marxism. You get two lines. And neither line is presumed more or less important than the other. They're qualitatively different, and the analytical trick is to understand the interaction. That idea in Gramsci is later formalized by Althusser when he borrows a thought from Freud in his analysis of dreams. And the idea is overdetermination, that anything that happens is the result of everything else impacting on that thing to make it what it is, and that's true of everything. Everything in economics is shaped by everything else, and everything else is shaped, among other things, by economics, and the trick is to grasp that interaction. That's why economics, if you use this mentality, has such a hard time with concepts of econometrics. Some variables are dependent and others are independent. No, not in overdetermination. You can't run that game. Nor can you decide in advance what are the independent values. Why 4? Why those 4? Why not 50 others? Well, your answer is because those 4 are more important than all the others. The only way you could know that is if you compare them to all the others. How many others are there? An infinity. How do you make such a comparison? You can't. That's a rule of mathematics. And yet we leap over this. So for us, Gramsci was a big step in the direction of the very overdetermination that we worked our way through with the help of Althusser and some of these other theories. Very, very important. Piero Sraffa is a different argument. That was a more narrowly focused argument in which certain problems in neoclassical general equilibrium kind of economic explanations of prices were shown to be intractable in fundamental ways. For a while, that gained some traction in economics, with neo-Ricardian economics and the questioning of all of that. But it could not sustain itself in the world of neoclassical dominance, and it faded out. It comes back periodically, but it faded out. And it will no doubt come back again, but it's a very different impact, for us anyway, than Gramsci's work.
So Rick, your work and Steve's work started with imperialism, right? Your first book was on Kenya, and Steve was on international economics and looking at. And then one of the best classes that I took with you guys was on colonialism, imperialism, and I remember very vividly the way the sort of different flows of value that move from one country to the north country, from England, etc. And why am I bringing this up? Because it's also when you were just speaking about the opening, which is actually very relevant in terms of understanding discourse, Marxism as a discourse that is now gaining traction in the United States. What's happening elsewhere? You referred to elsewhere as where capitalism is rising. So, but at the same time, when we look at what's happening in Turkey or Brazil, rising capitalism itself is creating a whole set of contradictions. And the dialectical relation maybe complicates the opening here as well as openings there.
Yeah, 2 quick comments. Yes, our early work was all about colonialism and imperialism, but the explanation for that, I don't mean to be simple-minded, but the basic explanation for that is that for Steve and me, the first explicit immersion in political struggles was around the war in Vietnam. And that's true for much of our generation. That was the defining explosive event that drew many of us into political organizations, meetings, organizing demonstrations. So for us, we were surrounded by people who wanted to understand, for example, how did the United States come to be involved in a war in Vietnam, which to us seemed to be outrageous, contradicting everything we thought the United States was supposed to stand for, et cetera, et cetera. And we had to answer those questions, and we tried to answer them systemically rather than a mistake of policy, or gee, you know, Rostow shouldn't have advised Kennedy, or those kinds of liberally sorts of explanations. So that's one of the reasons that was such an important issue for us. On your other point, which I think is very relevant today, the flip side of a capitalism that, I mean, I'll be over dramatic, but I want to drive the political point home, of a capitalism that is abandoning the parts of the world it was so successful in at the beginning. The flip side is it's arriving in Turkey and Brazil and China. And of course it will there replicate the very history it had in North America West, which is a history of immense conflict and struggle and strikes and demonstration. Of course, it will recapitulate there. But now we're going to have a very different situation. Those struggles were had in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, when you had a hinterland controlled through colonialism to moderate and to soften these conflicts in lots of ways. You're not going to have that. These conflicts are going to play themselves out in a much harsher way in those parts of the world today because they have a rumbling, troubled rest of the world that is not going to play the role of softener, that their capitalists cannot control so well. The very capitalists moving into that part of the world are having a hard time holding on to their bases back here because they're abandoning these people. So it's going to be a very different playing out of those struggles. There won't be the ease of cutting a deal. I mean, the deal made in the West was, we'll give you rising real wages. That's the deal. You know, we don't want to, but if you force us by strikes, by socialist parties, by trade unions, by all the rest of it, okay, we'll give you a deal. That's why we have, for the last 140 years, rising real wages in the United States. This is an amazing, and that's over. It's been over now for decades. And we're now going to go the other direction. I'm not sure that this kind of deal is going to be available to the capitalists in your part of the world, and that will make for a very different and much harsher kind of reality. You can see that in the way, for example, Bangladesh cannot cope with its crisis of killing large numbers of people in wobbly buildings where there are workshops and all. They can't deal with that in the way that the West had to deal after a while with that sort of thing.
Let's have the last question back there.
Could you talk louder?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
I'll speak up.
Okay.
Can you talk us through a potential trajectory you see for your idea of the democratization of the enterprise from the current point to where it could actually be implemented? And a slightly shorter term question related to that, you talked about the barrier of not being able to be a Marxist, either not being able to say it or being taken seriously or whatever. That barrier you passed. You were on Bill Myers, you had attention. What is the next big barrier or two big barriers that you think are really important to pass on the trajectory to seeing this potentially become a reality?
Let me try to answer the last part and then do the first part. A story. When I left UMass, and I was at that time already living in Manhattan when I finished my professorship here at UMass, a year or so around that time, I don't remember the timing, I was called into a branch of the New School University in New York City. And I met there with the dean who said that he wanted the New School to be the first place that has a graduate course on the economic crisis. And that asking me, would I teach this course? And I laughed, and I said, you must be kidding, you know who I am, which was a stupid thing for me to say, because it just pissed him off that I was implying he hadn't done his job to check out who I was, and he knew who I was, and so forth. And then he wondered if it would be all right if I was the NASDAQ visiting professor. And I said, if I thought it was crazy before, I think this is crazy squared, what you're suggesting. And he leaned across the table, this dean. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, some reporter is going to have a field day with this anomaly, or whatever you want to call it, this strange thing that you have this guy doing a course like this. And he leaned across the table with a real certainty. He said, that doesn't matter anymore. And I remember going home and saying to my wife, Harriet, these people are really crazy. But he was right, and I was wrong. It didn't matter. Nothing has ever happened. I've been teaching, by the way, I've been teaching a course on the economic crisis at the New School for many semesters now, and If I wish, I will do it until I drop dead. Something is changing in the United States. I have these kinds of experiences now more and more, and I do think so. As to where I go next, you may see me on other television programs, but I'm negotiating these things, and I'm learning as I go along. One of the conditions of these negotiations is you don't discuss them. So I can tell you I'm having them, and if they work out, you'll see me soon enough, more than you want. But the interest, it's a sobering lesson in the power of television. I am real in America in a way I never was before, and I became real by being a face on the screen. There's no way out around this. Very sobering, given how many of us, and for how long, we have not been able to access that medium. Very, very powerful, very clear. I would say half the invitations I have gotten since I was on the Bill Moyers program begin by saying, we'd like to invite you because we thought you were in Bill Moyers. I mean, it's a remarkable kind of thing. And Bill Moyers has been extremely cooperative, friendly. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better relationship and all of that. And I don't want to take away from what he does, but it's an astounding thing. As to how you go from here to there, rather than give you speculative answers about how it might be, let me very quickly summarize how it's already been. Because one important thing about this transition to democratic enterprise, it's not a futuristic idea, it's not a utopian ideal. It's an accomplished reality in lots of places in all kinds of ways. We have concrete empirical evidence all about it. So I will just tell you. If you have ever the occasion to catch a film made by Naomi Klein and her husband called The Take, it's a film about Argentina. And the film covers the period back in 2001, I think it was, when the Argentinian economy really collapsed so badly and so quickly that large numbers of big capitalists in Argentina closed their factories, left Argentina, and took up residences in their mansions in the south of France. Which, by the way, if you ever have a troubled moment in your life, is a very nice place to go, especially if you have a lovely mansion there. And you will be surrounded by more people than you can imagine who have had to leave their country on short notice. After 6 months of unemployment, the workers, large numbers of them, took over these factories, went into the abandoned factories. The film is very romantic and pretty. The workers dusting off the machines that had gotten rusty, oiling them up, and running them as worker co-op enterprises. So take a look at that film. That's one way. Workers literally take over when others abandon their production facilities. And that has happened in various ways in many places, including the United States. There's a famous little example that some of you know of in Chicago, the New Era Windows factory. The United Electrical Workers took over a window factory when it was abandoned basically by the private capitalist and are now running it in Chicago, but it's a small operation. Another example, the one that is most often cited in the world, but I think is worth people paying some attention to, is the famous example in the north of Spain, in the Basque country, the Mondragon System. 1956, a Catholic priest in an unbelievably poverty-stricken part of northern Spain. The Basque region is its own cultural, linguistic area, suffering from the Spanish Civil War and its effects, and then the Second World War, massive unemployment. This Catholic priest gets together 6 workers, gives them a little sermon about how if they wait for capitalists, they'll all die of old age before a capitalist comes, and gives them a job, so they should set up a little workers' co-op. And under the aegis of the Catholic Church in Spain, Father Arizmendi, as he was known, sets up this co-op in the small town of Mondragon in the north of Spain. So here we are now, 60-odd years afterwards. The Mondragon Corporation, as it's now called, is a collection of about 300 worker co-ops, unified under one corporate head. They have over 100,000 workers. They are the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain, and the largest corporation in the north of Spain, in the Basque area, the #1. They have outcompeted countless capitalist enterprises where they produce the same commodity. They have shown that it's possible to go from small to medium to very large. They are consulted on almost every facet of Spanish economic policy by whatever the government is, left, right, or center. They are an extraordinary study in successful worker co-op. The maximum range of income is 6.5 to 1. That is, the highest paid worker gets 6.5 times what the lowest paid worker does. The range here in the United States is about 300 or 400 to 1, by comparison. I visited Mondragon a little over a year ago, and it is as stunning a place to be taken through. They were extremely kind, took us all around. It's a remarkable study in how to grow. They have their own university called the Mondragon University, where there are courses in how to set up, how to finance and run cooperative enterprise. Mondragon has its own internal bank, which works out the financing and finding startup capital and growth capital for co-ops that want to expand. They have their own research laboratories, and their research is so advanced in technology that they have been approached for partnership agreements. With the two that I looked at in their labs is a partnership agreement with Microsoft and another one with General Motors. So in terms of what a co-op can do, they have shown pretty much, you name it, they've done it. And when you arrive in Mondragon at the headquarters, it is, for an American particularly, quasi-surrealistic. There on the sides of hills, Mondragon is a very hilly area, on the sides of the hills where they're located, they have their fancy buildings. They look like New Jersey headquarters of pharmaceutical companies. Very elaborate shrubbery that is obviously tended by a shrubbery company, and flowers just so, and little fountains outside and little smaller fountains inside, all of that. There you have exactly the same. So you think you're walking into a corporate headquarters until you discover how it's run, and it's a very interesting example of that kind of thing. A final example, I'll just give you another way. We have a website called democracyatwork.info where this kind of stuff is collected. If you're interested, just go to it. But we are now faced with a problem at our website, which is we get every day 4 or 5 inquiries of people who either want to start a co-op or want to work. They're looking for a job. They want to work in a co-op because they would rather work in a co-op environment than a top-down hierarchical. We can't handle it. We don't have the personnel. We don't have the infrastructure, at least not yet, to be able to do this. But there are, across the United States and around the world, co-op associations that are busily doing all this. This is not new. We don't need to invent the wheel over again. There's a lot of work being done. And there's also countless policy possibilities. Let me close with that. In 1985, Italy passed a law named after the legislator who pushed it through. Man's name, Hora. Hora. It's called the Hora Law. Here's what it does. It gives all unemployed in Italy a second option other than the one that they have here in the United States. In other words, an Italian unemployed person becomes unemployed, can go and get a weekly stipend, pay, for a year or two, whatever the eligibility rules are, like such a worker can do in the United States. But under Italian law, that worker has a second option, a plan B that he can choose. The Italian government will give this worker his entire 2 years of weekly payments as an upfront lump sum on 2 basic conditions. 1, he has to get, or he or she has to get 9 other workers to make the same choice. And second, they have to use that money as startup capital for a worker co-op. One of the reasons why Italy has many co-ops all across the country. Because many of them have been started as an explicit program to overcome unemployment. And here's the logic of it. It's not just that a worker who gets money to start a co-op may give more of himself or herself to make this successful, have more of a vested interest than simply going to work for somebody else. Not just that. It's also considered to be an act of democratic governance because it gives Italians genuine freedom of choice. By having co-ops everywhere, Italians as workers can choose between working for a capitalist structured enterprise or a co-op. They have that choice, practically. Americans have no such choice. And number two, it gives